Hey, grade 11s. Welcome to the next scandalous section of work. Scandalous is a strong word, but it's just relying off of the previous lesson with the whole idea of natural selection, the whole idea of basic evolution. We're breaking some boundaries over here, so let's continue. So, when you thought that biology couldn't get any more difficult, with the chemistry involved and the chemical pathways and the proteins, we had to go and throw some geography into it as well. So for those of you who've done geography before or do geography as a subject, you are lucky. This should be a little bit more, geared towards you, and hopefully you guys understand the basics of, what I'm eventually going to be explaining, but it's more about the biology a little bit later. All right, so we're going to be looking at the biogeography of flightless birds. So it's, in the name, bio, so living, geography, how things are distributed. The definition. So the distribution of plant and animal species in a specific geographical region. That is the definition of biogeography. And you need to know that because I'm going to ask you that. It's the idea that closely related species occur in the same geographical region, usually share a common ancestor. And we'll talk about that again, and we've been talking about it quite a lot. The word of common ancestor has come up quite often, but it's the idea that, we have to be able to share some sort of common ancestor, which allows us to change as individuals. So biogeographical regions isolated by large mountain regions, large masses of water and or oceans, and narrow land masses. So to be able to become a new species, I spoke about being put in different habitats and be able to be split away from the original common ancestor. There had to be some sort of barrier, and these are three different types of barriers that could lead to the change in species and natural selection, and also subdividing a particular habitat, and that habitat then creating a different individual based on how or what genetics they have inside of them. And these are the three: the large mountain region. So often we'll find that on one side of a mountain, another side of a mountain, specifically with small mammals and birds, that they are extremely different just because there's a big landmass. There's also famous stories where there was speciation between one specific group of birds because they hated to fly in the daylight because they would be predated on. And when there was cutting down in the Amazon rainforest to cut down or deforest a whole part of the land, they created this pathway through the middle of this forest. And all the birds on either side of this subdivided forest then became two different species because they would not fly between the two different forests. And that actually led to speciation. Then we have large masses of water or oceans. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. Specifically, I like to put a question in about bats, and you can actually go and Google it and you should be able to find the question. How one species of bat came from the mainland and landed on different islands, and this was because of strong winds, and those strong winds pushed them on these different islands, and the islands had different environments or habitats, and therefore they became different species eventually over time. Finally, we have the narrow land masses, and this is what I was talking about earlier, when they deforested that thin line, and this caused a whole bunch of drama with the birds. So these barriers prevent species spreading from one region to another. So there has to be some sort of isolation, and eventually we're going to learn this to be parapatric speciation. Sorry, my throat's a bit dry. All right, so animals and plants in different geographical regions with similar habitats and climates often differ drastically. Okay, so you can be in a cold area, but what's happening in one cold area and what's happening in the other cold area, even though it's the same temperature, same amount of wind, same amount of precipitation, could lead to completely different species forming as well. So for example, North and South Pole both covered in ice, but the North Pole has polar bears and the South Pole has penguins. Now, this was a famous question that I actually got asked in third year when I did biogeography and ecology. And the question was for 10 marks, and they just asked, why don't polar bears eat penguins? And you really had to go down this whole route of they don't eat each other because they're actually on different land masses, and those land masses were pushed around, and eventually we're going to be talking about something called continental drift. And if you've done grade 10 geography, you'll understand what continental drift is. For the rest of you, I'm going to have to teach you something brand new today. Otherwise, in Africa and South America, they have extremely similar climates, but Africa has elephants, lions, leopards, and zebra, chimpanzees, and gorillas, where South America have pumas, llamas, and jaguars. And to a large extent as well, if you think about Australia, they have a very similar climate to South Africa as well, yet we have mammals, and we give birth to live young, whereas they have marsupials, which also give birth to live young, but these really pathetic individuals which have to, grow up in a pouch, much like a kangaroo, if you think about a kangaroo. And if you don't know how a kangaroo actually functions, I recommend you go and watch a video about it. It's probably going to freak you out, though, about how this little pink thing climbs out of a kangaroo's female genitalia, climbs up through the fur into the pouch that they have, and then it attaches itself to an udder or a nipple, and just sit in there and suck on milk until they grow. So marsupials act extremely weird. So, even to a large extent, like same habitats but different land masses can allow for quite a variation of species. So biogeography of flightless birds. So now we're talking about these flightless birds, and we all know what the ostrich looks like. Well, hopefully I have some pictures just in case you don't know what an ostrich looks like. These flightless birds cannot fly, even though they have feathers and they have all the other bits and pieces which make them look like a bird. They just don't fly. They look for food and build nests on the ground. Examples are ostriches, emus, rheas, moa, and the cassowary. Now, unfortunately, the moa is actually extinct, but this bird stood about 2 to 2.5 average male height, like long. That's how it was huge. I mean, it was actually like almost about 4 meters tall. I'll show you a picture in the next slide, but they are so big. So what you're noticing is that ostriches are in South Africa, emus are in Australia, rheas South America, moa New Zealand, and the cassowary is currently, it's still around, New Guinea. These flightless birds have similarities but occur on different land masses and are different species. So because they're in similar environments but different land masses, they have adapted to their land mass, ultimately creating brand new species. So I want you, before I go to the next slide, I want you to think what South Africa, Australia, South America, New Zealand, and New Guinea all have in common. And not necessarily right now, but many, many, many millions of years ago. So let's have a look at what these bad boys look like. All right, so on the top left-hand corner, we have your ostrich. You all should recognize it. Next to it on the right-hand side is an emu, a much shorter, doesn't have as much a long neck, quite aggressive structures. Then at the bottom left-hand corner, we have the cassowary. Then the middle bottom in the grayscale, we have the moa. Those are the ancient, I think it's, what are they, the Aboriginals or the Aboriginals in Australia? I can't remember. Anyway, the original locals of New Zealand, and they had those extremely large moas. And then finally we have the rhea on the right hand side over there. And you can all see that they share very, very, very similar characteristics. They all have these fine feathers. They have extremely large wings. Even though they can't fly, they've got extremely long legs. At the end, they've got a 3-toed talon, and those talons are for fighting. They've got relatively long necks, so they can reach up and collect some berries, except for the emu, it's pathetic. But yeah, they are large birds, and we like to ride them in South Africa and Grahamstown if you ever want to go do that. I have never. I'm too large. I will break its back. So, but some people do it. Right, so let's look at the similarities between all these different birds. The bones in their feathers are small. Their breastbone has no keel, which is the enlarged breastbone. I recommend you go and Google it. Whenever you're eating a chicken and you're taking the breast off of the chicken itself, you'll notice that where the breast sits, the whole middle part of its sternum, which is the breastbone that you guys know, almost comes to a point, and that allows for a larger muscle attachment. And even though it has larger muscle attachment, it still can't fly because of how its feathers are developed. In a magical world, I would like to see what a flying ostrich would look like. I would hate to see its poops though, but it would be quite cool to see. So If there are different species in different biogeographical areas, separated by barriers or oceans, how is it that they have similarity? So how is it that they could have had a common ancestor in common? And that is because of continental drift. So I've put a GIF at the bottom over there. Yes, we say GIF and not GIF. This is showing you specifically how those land masses moved over time. So continental drift relies on the idea that you know a couple of things. One, that the center of the earth is molten lava. Number two, that when it dried on the surface, it actually created plates. Okay, so these continental plates have land masses on top of them that poke out of the water. Those land masses, or those plates, are actually able to shift and move because technically they're floating on top of molten lava. And if you think I'm being completely ridiculous, please note that the continents are actually still moving. They move about, I think it's about 10 centimeters every year. So we are still moving. And we can actually see this in real time. So we know that this is a reality. And I asked you earlier what you thought that all those land masses had in common, and it was the fact that they were all joined. So you can see as the GIF moves over there at approximately 150 million years ago, all those land masses were directly attached to each other, creating one supercontinent, okay? And that supercontinent was known as Pangea. Eventually, in the next slide, I'm going to teach you about Laurasia and Gondwanaland, and specifically only Gondwanaland because it was important. But you can imagine that 150 million years ago, when all those land masses were attached to each other, that there was one specific common ancestor, and its distribution was over all of those land masses. When they were over all of those land masses, over time they've created a species, and then as those continents started shifting apart or further from each other, they didn't have access to each other anymore, creating a barrier and isolating these different groups, or the same group of common ancestor. And over time, as these land masses pushed further and further away, they started to inhabit different environments, and those environments caused the individual itself to start adapting and becoming new species based on its genetics. All right, so 220 million years ago, all the continents were one supercontinent called Pangea. I don't like asking about Pangea, but I do like asking about Gondwanaland, which we'll see next. Pangea split into two large land masses that drifted apart. And you can see the bottom right-hand corner over there. I've included a nice little diagram where Pangea split into Laurasia and Gondwanaland. If you'd like to go watch a video about this, you're more than welcome to. It's really great. I'd probably show you one in class, so it's quite interesting. Eventually, the southern landmass was known as Gondwanaland, and 120 million years ago, Gondwanaland split into South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, New Zealand, New Guinea, and India. Yes, somehow India was actually attached very close to South Africa, and it moved sort of northeast and smashed into the whole of Asia, becoming an Asian part of the Asian continent, even though it was actually part of the southern continent. At 135 million years ago, you can actually see next to Africa there is a white landmass, and that is actually India, and it moves directly upwards and eventually smashes directly into the Asian continent. Now, there's a couple of problems with this. So as much as we know this to be true, we struggled quite a bit. There was a whole bunch of really fancy statisticians who mapped the barriers, or what's the word I'm looking for? The outer layer of the outer rims of all the continents, and try to fit them together. And unfortunately, mathematics can't prove our idea of continental drift, but we know that our continents are drifting, and we know that the barriers or boundaries of these continents are actually starting to be eaten away because of the ocean. And there were so many millions of years ago that they actually don't really like resemble what we look like. Also, in case you're wondering, the shifting of these plates can actually cause earthquakes as well, and tsunamis. So, it's not like biology is the only people who are like, oh, the land masses are moving. The geographers were the first ones to actually point this out. And then biologists were like, hey, well, there's different species. One of the other fun ways of remembering this is that Africa has, or knowing where these land masses were attached to, South Africa specifically has the fynbos, and we learned about that last year. And I said to you, one of the keystone species over there is the protea, okay? And that beautiful little protea actually was, we thought that it, well, the king protea specifically is endemic to South Africa, but there were other types of proteas that we found on the far western coast of Australia. And it is under very, very, very specific conditions that these grow. And we're wondering, like, we have majority of the species of protea. How did it get onto Australia? And that was because Australia was directly attached to the most southern tip of Africa, and that is how the distribution of proteas is now split between South Africa and Australia. Finally, scientists suggest that common ancestors of flightless birds lived on Gondwanaland. Then it broke up via continental drift. The birds were geographically separated. Climate and habitats changed due to continental drift, and the flightless birds adapted and formed new species. This comes up again, like over and over again, and this will definitely be in your, if we're writing June exams, will be in your June exam, and or it will be in your final. I will make sure. So please note that this whole slide will really be at like quite extensively tested, and I might make you do a flow diagram on this kind of stuff. So make sure that you go through this a couple of times, and if you want to go have a look at the moa, imagine living with something that tall. They actually became extinct because they were hunted till extinction, unfortunately. And also they lived on New Zealand, which is, it's cold and pathetic and all those other wonderful bits and pieces. So anyway, I hope that went well for you, and I will see you guys soon. We're also now finished with the scandalous work, and we're going to be starting ecology next. So we're going to be doing air pollution, water pollution, air, water, land pollution, and then we're going to be doing a whole bunch of ecology. And remember, I am an ecologist. I love that section, so we should be able to do quite a good job of it. All right, look after yourselves. Cheers.